Hi, I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the Carnegie Endowment's Program on American Statecraft. And we're here this morning to discuss President Biden's trip to Europe, which begins this weekend. I've got two superb experts here with me for this conversation. First of all, Rose Gottemoeller, who served as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019, in addition to being the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs for 4 years before that. I'm also pleased to have Professor Charlie Kupchan, who was President Obama's top expert on Europe from 2014 to 2017. He's currently at Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations. So we're going to do some discussion among the three of us about the trip, and then I'm going to turn it over to the other participants out there to give all of you a chance to pose questions of your own. We expect this whole session to go probably about 45 minutes. So let me start by talking a little bit about the stakes of this trip. I mean, to me, the stakes here seem unusually high. Domestically, Biden faces heavy seas. And I think the question is whether going overseas, abroad, for a trip like this is going to potentially help him boost his domestic approval ratings, or whether it might actually hurt him. Internationally, it seems to me that there's an unusual amount of urgency to these two summits. For NATO, obviously, you've got the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II going on. And for the G7, which was created to coordinate policy, economic policy among the world's leading economies, you've got a surge in inflation that's threatening to wreak political and economic havoc on the world's largest economies. So for me, the stakes of these meetings, the G7 and the NATO summit, seem unusually high. But let me turn it over to our panelists here to get their thoughts. Rose, do you want to go first? And do you agree that this is unusually important, these meetings, or do you see it differently?
I think every summit meeting, every trip of the president abroad is important. In this case, I think it's vital. There are major strategic objectives. NATO was astoundingly coherent following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia back in February, and really pulled together strongly. And as NATO countries have been pouring assistance into Ukraine, either defense assistance and or humanitarian aid, which is absolutely fantastic, but there are some fissures starting to show in the alliance. So I think it will be important for the president to really bolster that coherence and that willingness to work strongly together to continue to support Ukraine through a long war. But as far as the G7 is concerned, and the NATO countries in general and EU, it is important to figure out the messages to carry back to every public about inflation and this long haul, and how there will have to be some belt tightening, but at the same time, leaders are doing something about it and doing things that will help to counter what is essentially weaponization of so many issues by the Kremlin, whether you're talking about food assistance, whether you're talking about the inability of the Ukrainian farmers to get their harvest out to feed a hungry globe, or whether you're talking about what is the gas and oil policy of the Kremlin toward Europe, and the way that policy is being driven in a way to create maximum discontent. There will have to be, I think, a real show of will with regard to these Kremlin policies and the policies of Vladimir Putin.
So it's an opportunity for both NATO and the G7 to demonstrate that they can really deliver on these issues.
Absolutely.
Charlie, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important trip. I'm glad that a G7 meeting is coupled with a NATO meeting for a couple of different reasons. One is that, the G7 is a smaller group. It's a great place to signals check and to set the next steps. And one of the assets of a G7 meeting is that it's not as scripted as a NATO summit. In NATO summits, there are a lot of seats at the table. Everybody gets there 5 minutes to say something. In the G7, there is greater flexibility. And I think this is a moment when leaders really do need to roll up their sleeves and have frank conversations with each other. And the other important aspect here is that a lot of what needs to be discussed does not fall squarely onto NATO's agenda. There's a huge traditional security piece to this, but as Rose just said, there's also food security. There is the energy piece of this. There's climate change. There's a lot of stuff that is more geoeconomic in nature than geostrategic in nature. And I think it's therefore fortunate that there is this G7 NATO tag team setup. At the G7, I guess I would sort of identify three key issues that I would encourage the Biden team to address. One is, where are we on the sanctions effort? Where are we on continuing to put pressure on the Russian economy? And the G7 is the right place to have that conversation, because you need all the world's major economies to be in lockstep to make the sanctions most effective. Second, and Rose mentioned this already, I think we have an urgent need to try to open up Ukraine's ports to get grain out. And that's because we are looking at a humanitarian emergency in the global south, Africa in particular. We're looking at potential spillover of migrants flowing into Europe. And this strikes me as a place where, even if the war is continuing, you might be able to get breakthrough that sort of breaks the ice by having Ukraine demine the harbors and Russia agree to end the blockade. I'm not a fan of NATO going in there and going after Russian ships. That strikes me as too escalatory. But I think opening up Ukraine's ports, right? The silos are full. The second harvest is coming in. This would be a great time to have a breakthrough on that front. Final comment, Chris, and it really returns to where you opened us up. What most worries me right now about where we are in the war against Ukraine, and I agree with Rose that the response of the US, its NATO partners, the G7, has been remarkable. It's been resolute, it's been coordinated, it has been very far-reaching, but it's having political and economic blowback effects that I really think we need to keep an eye on. As we were talking about just before we started, Chris, I just came back from Berlin. They're a little wobbly. Here in the United States, right, we're seeing gas get near $5.50 a gallon. We're looking at food prices that keep going up. Biden's chances in the November midterm don't look good, right? I mean, most people think the House is going to flip, and maybe the Senate too. So the G7 would be a very good place to have a discussion about the effects of the war on the global economy and what can be done to deal with inflation, to deal with the fact that the IMF is downgrading global growth. I'm not enough of an expert to come up with a great set of suggestions, but if there's something that most keeps me up at night right now, it's this issue.
That's great. We've already got a lot of things to talk about here. Rose, let me just ask you about how you see the relationship between NATO's role here and the G7's role here. Charlie's pointed out that a lot of the issues that are on the table right now are not hard security issues. Clearly, NATO has a big role in any kind of a security crisis in Europe, like the one we have now. And so does the G7. So, in your time, both in the US government and then especially at NATO, how do you understand that relationship?
Well, let me start by picking up on the example of food security, which I think is so vital here. And I absolutely agree with Charlie that it should not be NATO that is escorting merchant ships into Odessa and helping to get grain out. I've been heartened to see that the United Nations has been taking a leading role, very quiet and behind the scenes, in trying to move forward these negotiations among Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey is very much involved, as well as the overseer of the Montreux Convention, obviously vital to shipping and navigation in the Black Sea. So if we can effect a breakthrough here, I think it will be extraordinarily important. But here is where I am very worried about the role that Putin and the Kremlin and the Russian Federation overall are playing. They seem determined, because of the stalemate on the battlefield and their determination to win this thing, to weaponize every tool in every way they can. And on the economic front, that I think is already heading us down a road that, well, at least as President Biden himself says, these are Putin's gas prices. These are Putin's pressures on our economy. But I'm frankly not sure how well that works in the domestic, with the domestic audience. And that was a point you also asked about early on, Chris. Frankly, I'm not sure how well the foreign trip works in terms of bolstering Biden's popularity back home. I just don't think people care about it that much. What they care about is seeing results. And that brings me back to the G7 and what the G7 can do to help, I think, to counter inflationary trends by perhaps more coordination among the central banks. Again, here, I am not an expert. I'm an expert on nuclear policy. But I think that emphasis on economic policy and what can be done in order to coordinate the response to these inflationary trends, I think will be really important in the upcoming period. And so I expect that will be a top priority issue for the G7 discussions. That picks up on what Charlie was talking about, but energy policy as well. By the way, Charlie, $5.50 seems cheap to us out here in California, where $6.50 is more like it at the pump per gallon. So, but that's because of California and all those regulations they pile on. In any event, I do think that the trade and economic policies will be all important for the G7, and that is the role that they have to play.
It's really interesting what you say, Rose. I mean, it occurs to me that it may be that the most important concrete deliverable that Biden can get out of this trip would actually come out of the G7 in the form of some kind of coordinated action that builds confidence in global markets that this inflation is actually going to come down.
Well, yes, that it will come down, but also that that there's somebody driving the train, that this is not an inflationary spiral that is totally out of control, and that no one has any levers to try to influence. And so I think that will be the message that will be all important, that there is someone driving the train. That's the G7. That's the G7 finance ministers, central banks, and ultimately the heads of state and government.
And I would note it is an opportunity for Biden. I take what you say about, that the trip may not do that much to help his domestic ratings. But if you think about it globally, there is an opportunity here at least to show American leadership, given what's going on in Moscow right now. And obviously the fact that President Xi is basically on lockdown in China. This is an opportunity for liberal democracies to come together and demonstrate that they actually can deal with these global problems, isn't it?
Oh, I think absolutely, yes. And that is important. It so happens, I think, that this group of leaders tends to work together well, and that so they can present a coherent front, and I hope an articulate front as well, in talking about their objectives and what they plan to accomplish in a positive way going forward.
Maybe we should turn a little bit to NATO. We've already started talking about it some, and I think you've both noted that obviously there was an enormous amount of unity 4 months ago when Russia first invaded Ukraine. But over the course of the last weeks, even months, we've seen some tensions emerge within the alliance. Obviously, there continues to be strong support for Kiev, but you do have some countries who appear to be more concerned about trying to bring this war to a close sooner rather than later. And then other countries who are insistent that we should push on in supporting Ukraine until Ukraine, quote unquote, wins the war. I sort of wonder, Charlie, how do you see U.S. policy in this, given the tension that you've already brought up between the fact that on the one hand, Ukraine is, being support to Ukraine is a popular thing here in America and probably helps Biden. But on the other hand, one of the consequences of that is tension with Russia, which is contributing to inflation and hurting Biden back home. So where do you see the administration coming down between these two sort of tendencies within the alliance? And what do you think they ought to do? What do you think Biden ought to try to do when he gets there to try to steer it one way or the other?
Well, as you know, Chris, I'm in the bring it to a close sooner rather than later camp, in the sense that I worry that time is not on Ukraine's side in several different respects. One is that the battlefield has shifted, the momentum has shifted, and the Russians seem to be having a measure of success in taking over at least one of the oblasts, probably not the other. And it's going to be hard, I think, for the Ukrainians, even if they get more weapons, to retake territory that Russia has taken. I don't believe that the expulsion of Russian troops from Ukraine and getting back to the 2014 boundaries is in the realm of the possible. And as a consequence, I think you therefore need to begin a conversation about war termination. The Biden administration has so far not gone down that road. In fact, they have said the opposite. We are not going to tell the Ukrainians when to negotiate, how to negotiate. We're not going to discuss territorial concessions with them. I would encourage the administration during this trip to start that conversation. I think it's time to have that conversation. I think that they're getting a demand signal from Europe that they would like that conversation to begin. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, another reason that I don't think time is on our side is that the spillover effects will deepen over time. I mean, it's now warm in Europe. People are not turning on their heat. Industries are getting the gas that they need. You know, if we're still in the middle of a war and the temperature starts to go down and people turn their heaters on, you could well be looking at gas rationing in Germany. You could well be looking at people that are having trouble turning their lights on and they're heating their apartments. I don't think we want to go down that road, right? There is already a lot of debate in Germany about this issue. You may have noticed that the Italian government has just experienced a defection on this issue. So I think that Washington should get ahead of the curve and start this conversation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're ready for a ceasefire and that we should push the Ukrainians on that front. But now is the time to, I think, set that table before we find ourselves fighting rearguard actions on the domestic front that make this more and more difficult. And I really do worry that the America First Republican crowd is going to do well in November. And if that happens, the domestic landscape here is going to be much more difficult for Biden. So this is the time for that conversation to start.
Rose, what do you think? Do you think Biden should be pushing the alliance in one direction or another?
Well, Charlie, there's a demand signal from Europe, but it's coming from some Europeans. It's coming from the Italians. It's coming from the French. It's coming from the Germans. The swath along the borderlands with Russia, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, essentially the former Warsaw Pact countries, now members of NATO, are in quite a different place. And that represents the fissure I referred to earlier in talking about what's going on inside NATO. This is nothing new, of course. Those countries have always been highly suspicious of Russia and really, I would say, quite dismissive of the value of diplomacy with Russia. So that is informing their thinking now. And frankly, they are scared out of their wits that Russia's coming after them next. My view is Russia is grinding up its armed forces in Ukraine, and it is barely able to continue the fight along its 1,000-kilometer front in Ukraine now. So the idea that they would invade now NATO is, to my mind, somewhat somewhat nutty, but nevertheless, that is a high anxiety in Central and Eastern Europe. And so Biden has to also navigate that territory. By the way, I thought it was very interesting. We'll probably talk about Sweden and Finland, but I thought it was very interesting that the reason both Helsinki and Stockholm gave for not being so worried about a Russian military response to their joining NATO is that very reason, that Russia is preoccupied. It's fully wound up in its Ukraine adventure, and it doesn't have anything left over really to put military force down against Sweden and Finland. So I think that is interesting. Again, debatable, but what does that do to this this notion that somehow Biden should begin to set the table for negotiations? I think if he does so, it should be done very quietly and behind the scenes, testing water on all fronts, including with the Central and East Europeans, and being very clear about certain principles. The one principle I think that can never be discarded is the principle that Ukraine does not give up on its territorial integrity. And throughout the course of the Cold War, we never recognized we never recognized that the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union. It took 70 years, but eventually they resumed their independence and sovereignty. So I think we have to ensure that that principle is never discarded in the case of Ukraine. That's why I disagreed so much with Henry Kissinger's presentation when he spoke on this matter several weeks ago. That principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty must be sustained, even if it takes some period of time for Ukraine to resume full control of its territory. So that's where my head is at on this issue, and I would by no means take this up in a public setting.
So just to pull on that final point that you were making about the principle of territorial integrity, do you envision a situation in which there is an end to the fighting, some kind of a peace treaty, and the question of whether or not the occupied territory is Russian or Ukrainian is put into abeyance, or does the war need to go on until that's settled on the battlefield?
I just think that Ukraine never gives up on the notion that that territory belongs to it. And as President Zelensky has said, that every Russian soldier must be off that territory at some point in the future. He doesn't say at some point in the future, because they are keeping the emphasis now on the intensity of the fight and trying to at least get the Russians back to the February 23rd line. It's my understanding that that's where Kiev's head is at in terms of being able to get to the negotiating table. But again, whether the long-term weapon systems or long-range weapon systems that the United States, Britain, and others are providing can help the Ukrainians to achieve that, I can't judge from this distance. But that is how the Kiev government seems to be thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Rose about the principle. I just think that at some point, when we do get a stalemate or very little movement on the battlefield, we want to try to move to an end to the destruction and the killing, and then begin a process, even if it doesn't really go anywhere, on the ultimate disposition of territory. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then we just wait it out, just as we did with the Baltics. And it may be that it's not until Putin leaves power that this issue is able to be settled. But I would not like to see this war go on until full sovereignty has been restored.
Yeah, a quick question to you, Charlie. Don't you think we're at that point of grinding stalemate now, or
yes, and that's why I think it's time to open the door to seeing if you can't have a combination of open the ports, get a truce or ceasefire of some sort, and create at least a framework for diplomacy.
Yeah, and by the way, I agree that opening the ports is all important at this moment, both for getting the food out to global markets, but also to put some momentum in a more positive direction, that there can be some problem solving going on at the negotiating table in this terrible crisis.
Yeah, I really think we need something to break the ice, and opening the ports could do that.
Would either
literally and figuratively
support the proposals that are out there for NATO to serve as an escort to third country vessels to go in and get that grain out?
I absolutely disagree with that notion. I think individual NATO countries could participate in an escort, but NATO as an institution, absolutely not. It's not needed. I think, frankly, also, we should be getting the countries who actually need the food assistance. If they have capable naval vessels, they should be invited by the UN to participate in the escort. It should be an international, a global effort to really move this grain to, excuse me, to move this grain to market.
And I also, I do think that escalation is a risk. And for the same reason that we don't have troops on the ground, the same reason we don't enforce a no-fly zone, I would be reluctant to see NATO vessels get into a shooting war with Russian vessels.
Let me ask about Finland and Sweden, since it's already come up. Obviously, if you go back to April, it seemed like it was a near certainty that they would be invited to join NATO at this summit. Now, obviously, President Erdogan, for his own domestic reasons, has held up their candidacy. Would either of you recommend that Biden, when he goes into the summit, try to lean on Erdogan, use some of his political capital to try and break this deadlock? Or is that not really a role for the United States right now?
Well, my view is the United States is already leaning on Erdogan, again, quietly and behind the scenes. I think it is important. There's a very intense negotiation going on. The Turks are such clever negotiators. They're very good at that. And so they have maxed the pressure. They've been putting out the message that, oh, we don't need to solve this by this summit meeting. Maybe by the next NATO summit meeting in a year's time, we'll be ready to solve this problem. So they're upping the pressure to the max in the public square. But I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes now. Sweden and Finland, of course, are taking some steps to satisfy concerns about terrorism. I do not believe, by the way, that will add up to anything that would endanger the citizens and refugees living in Sweden, particularly in Finland. I know that there's been pressure on extradition in some cases. Certainly the United States itself has had extradition pressure from Turkey for Fatih Gülen, the cleric who the Turks accuse, Erdogan accuses of instigating the coup in 2016. But I think that those countries will stand on the principle of protecting those whom they have extended their citizenship and other protections to. But making statements about terrorism, taking some steps perhaps to address that in a way that will satisfy Erdogan. And then I think the United States, in the end of the day, will sweeten the pot. I wouldn't be surprised to see the F-16s, the new F-16s that Turkey has asked for, being part of the final deal.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Chris. I think that, right now we're in the bazaar. And doing diplomacy with the Turks is like shopping in a Turkish bazaar. I'm confident that this issue will be resolved and that Sweden and Finland, assuming they still are interested, will join NATO. And it's not going to take that long. And I do think that there are areas, there is trade space, and Rose just mentioned one of them. The fallout over the F-35 because of the S-400s. There's now a discussion about getting F-16s. My understanding is the holdup is in Congress. That should be something that can be addressed. So I think this is a fly in the ointment and not a serious roadblock.
That's great. We're going to want to go to our audience here to get their questions in just a minute. So if any of you out there are ready and you want to start putting your questions into the YouTube chat, please start doing so. Before we go to them, one final question for the two of you, which is about the strategic concept. And I guess, Rose, this is especially for you. NATO's been talking about developing a new strategic concept for a few years now. obviously now has succeeded in doing so. In the meantime, of course, we've had a war with Ukraine. Now, I obviously people were cognizant of the challenge from Russia before the war, but you know, what do you think the alliance ought to be doing with the strategic concept? What should we expect from that, and how important do you think it's going to be to the alliance's future in what clearly is going to be a long-term security competition between NATO and Russia?
Yes, the strategic concept is NATO's major statement of its strategic objectives, its purpose in life. And the one currently in existence was from 2010. It states in part that Europe is at peace and there are no conventional military threats to NATO. So it's high time. It rang hollow even in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and destabilized the Donbass. But at that time, I think NATO was properly preoccupied with putting in place the battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland, working on reinforcement, building up its capability to rapidly reinforce again. So it didn't want to take the time and expend the energy then to redo the strategic concept. But it is high time, 10 years later, to redo the strategic concept at the time of this dreadful war in Ukraine. So the objectives will be, I think, to reinforce that message about the deterrence and defense strength of the NATO alliance and its ability to defend all of its member states against whatever may occur. The new angle will be China. That was something, frankly, that the strategic concept was really going to focus on as the United States brings its military attention and force to the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. NATO was going to have to articulate its support for that effort, not moving NATO to operate in the Indo-Pacific, but essentially being willing to really reinforce the defense of Europe while the United States is preoccupied elsewhere. So that was going to be brand new for the alliance because of what happened in Ukraine. Now NATO does have to really renew the strength of its determination to defend European territory and the territory of NATO allies from military threats. And here's what I think is also going to be important in the new strategic concept: how to deter weapons of mass destruction and the kinds of threats that Russia has been brandishing during this war, involving nuclear weapons, of course, but also chemical, biological, and radiological threats. So I do think that will be an aspect of the new strategic concept that perhaps, again, NATO probably wished it didn't have to wrestle with these issues quite so much, but I think it will be important this time around.
Charlie, do you have any comments you want to make about the strategic concept? If not, I actually have another question for you.
Why don't you pose the question and maybe I'll try to hit both of them. Okay.
And I will remind our audience that we're open to Q&A now. I don't see any questions in yet, but if someone has a question that they'd like to pose, we're ready to take questions from the audience. Charlie, what I'm wondering about is we've been talking about such a broad range of issues here, ranging from naval issues in the Black Sea, obviously to the situation on the battleground in eastern Ukraine, to global inflation. From the position that you had in the White House as the president's main Europe advisor, what would you be telling Biden is the most important thing that he accomplish over the course of the next week during this trip to Europe? Is there one thing that you could point out as, it's really important that we get this one thing done? Maybe it's two.
On the strategic concept, I think that obviously there's going to be a new focus on deterrence and defense in Europe. NATO's traditional mission is back, and it's going to be back for quite some time, and that really does require a kind of change in thinking and posture. I think that the war in Ukraine also invites NATO to address a set of questions which may or may not get discussed in Madrid, but I think need to be part of a longer term discussion. One is the future of enlargement and how to deal with what we call Europe's gray zone. It looks like the EU is going to move forward with enlargement to Ukraine, Moldova, eventually Georgia. So that kind of creates a new development. A second issue is to take full advantage of what appears to be a new readiness in Europe to spend more on defense. You know, Germany's investment of 100 billion and then meeting the 2% benchmark, assuming all of that happens, that's a big deal. We need to make the most of it. And then there's this, you know, the other issue that I think is out there, and we talked about it at the beginning of our chat, Chris, is how much this war underscores the ways in which globalization and interdependence have complicated the security agenda. Everything is connected to everything. And I think that requires us to think through the, what's the right format for talking about deterring Russia, energy security, links to climate, cyber. These are no longer issues that can be separated. Final comment in direct response to your question. I would say the main goal here is to maintain unity and to continue what has been so far a remarkable steadiness among key democratic allies. It's been very impressive. It is the best way to push back against Russia, because I think Putin, and this is true of 2014 as well as 2022, he keeps thinking that he can crack us. He keeps thinking that he can peel the US away from Europe and pit the Germans against the Poles. And yes, Rose is right. To some extent, that's working. Poland is not happy with the fact that Germany is not delivering heavy weapons right now. But I think we want to come back from this week with a sense of steady as she goes. And then the final comment would be, I'd love to see some progress on the issue of the global economy, because as I said, that's worrying me a lot. And I think Americans care about Ukraine. They've demonstrated a readiness to sacrifice because of Ukraine, but there are limits. And I do think that we need to keep a very, very close watch on the domestic political landscape, because, you know, we don't want to stand up to Putin in Ukraine and then find that the Atlantic Alliance falls prey to homegrown threats, i.e. illiberal populism.
And I think the French legislative elections just in the last few days really drive that point home, because it seems that one of the reasons why President Macron lost seats was to the hard right and to the hard left was exactly because of these economic issues. But now we've got some questions from the audience here, so I want to go to those. But Charlie, you've given me a good segue to do so in mentioning, you know, the extraordinary complexity of the world today. And the interdependence of so many different issues and nations. One thing, interestingly, that we haven't even talked about yet is the interdependence of the United States, Europe, and China. It's interesting to me because a year ago, we certainly probably would have started off this conversation with China, but we haven't talked very much about it yet. So we have a question about, how does China fit into this picture? I wonder if either of you would be willing to comment on that. How should is there a China issue at this summit, or do all of these other issues sort of have they overwhelmed what would have been a year ago, you know, a pretty big effort to try to galvanize support, certainly within NATO, for a tougher line with Beijing?
Yeah, maybe I'll start on this because, as I mentioned, China was really supposed to dominate, to be one of the major priorities for NATO in thinking through and deciding how to treat China in the strategic concept. It was supposed to, you know, really be part and parcel of the strategic concept. But Charlie is right. I mean, deterrence and defense in Europe is really going to be front and center for NATO in this upcoming summit and in the new strategic concept. So as far as the United States is concerned, its stance toward China has been one of warning it off, playing economically with Russia at the current time, sanctions busting, so to say. And Beijing has been, as far as I can tell, very cautious, concerned about secondary sanctions, and so has been very cautious about essentially picking up economic slack with the Russians and really helping them out through this economic crisis that the global sanctions, not global, but certainly I would say the major economic powers, their sanctions against Russia at the current time. But at the same time, the Xi leadership and Xi himself, they are lending a lot of moral support to the Russians in both their declaratory stance, but also in the way they're voting, for example, in the United Nations. So they're walking a very fine line. And going forward, I'm trying to think through how the United States should really be balancing its policies with China in certain key areas. Just yesterday, I was on a very interesting call talking about polar research and what's going on now that Russia has absented itself from, and we have absented Russia from so much cooperation on climate change in Arctic regions. Well, of course, there are major Arctic presence, and the melting of the permafrost is affecting our global climate health. And so, how do we figure out how to work perhaps more with China to ensure that we are getting the best possible analysis going now in this area? Because again, this is an existential issue for the entire world. So it's just a small example, but I think we should be thinking strategically about how we continue to engage with China while we have a huge number of problems with the way they are throwing around their military weight in the Indo-Pacific and continuing concerns about their pressures against Taiwan. So it's for us a delicate balancing act as well. And I do expect that this will be on the agenda for the G7 leaders, especially since the key leaders in the Indo-Pacific will be also at that table.
I've got a couple of questions here, more questions from the audience that I want to throw at you. Some about U.S. domestic, the effects of U.S. domestic politics, and some more specifically about Russia and Ukraine. So I'm going to start with the Russia-Ukraine questions, and then maybe we can conclude by going back to the domestic American politics of this trip. The question that we have two really questions related to Russia and Ukraine. The first one is fairly straightforward, which is whether or not NATO ought to, at this summit, take any concrete steps to move away from the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. That's something that has been on the table. But the question is whether or not NATO ought to take some kind of a formal step to move away from that agreement. The second is a broader question that's been on many of our minds for a long time now, which has to do with whether or not the NATO or Russia has the upper hand if this war drags on for many years. That's obviously a key strategic question. And I'd like to hear what both of you think about either of those two questions. Charlie, why don't we start with you?
Just a quick follow-up on the China issue. I agree with Rose that the glass is kind of half full and half empty. The Chinese have given the Russians moral support and stood by them, but it could be a lot worse. They are not arming the Russians. They are not busting sanctions. So, let's keep an eye on where that relationship goes. One issue that I do think will be very interesting to watch is how much decoupling results from this episode. Are we about to enter a period of deglobalization in which we've all watched Russia get smoked by the sanctions and ask ourselves, do we want to continue with that level of global economic interdependence? And Russia and China is at a disadvantage here, particularly in terms of the financial system, where the renminbi is still not an international currency, and that puts them at a certain disadvantage when it comes to thinking through the implications of the war economically. On the questions you just asked, Chris, I don't know. I haven't really thought through the NATO-Russia Founding Act issue. I would say this. NATO would be fully justified in pulling down the NATO-Russia Founding Act because it was predicated upon a set of strategic assumptions which Russia has violated. Whether it should do so, I'm going to rely on Rose to answer. Part of the, I think it can do a lot of what it needs to do without tearing up.
Exactly.
Yeah, right?
Exactly.
You can just keep putting forces there. You can rotate them occasionally, and you have thereby maintained the provision of no permanent major combat forces.
So no reason to make a show of tearing it up. Just ignore it.
I absolutely agree with that.
But
Yeah,
that doesn't
exactly.
strike me as necessary.
It takes you right back to that fissure we've been talking about, and the amount of capital that would have to be burnt to get through this issue around the North Atlantic Council table. It is just not worth it. NATO needs to keep its eye on the prize of bolstering defense and deterrence for NATO and supporting Ukraine, instead of, wrapping itself around the axle on tearing up the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Sorry, Charlie, back to you.
I would agree with that. I think we're in the same place.
So then maybe to both of you, strategically, who has the upper hand if this war drags on, say for many more months or years? Russia or NATO?
Nobody, right? This is a war with no winners. And that's why I'm someone who believes we should try to wrestle it to the ground sooner rather than later. And let's be honest, I think the most likely outcome for now is something that looks like a frozen conflict in which the war dies down. Russia does not agree to pull out. We have a Minsk III or something like that to deal with the longer term diplomatic / territorial issues. And it may not move anytime soon, but that strikes me as a preferable outcome to a war that continues to kill tens of thousands of people and cause huge disruptions to the global economy.
Rose?
The way I've been thinking about it, Chris, is that essentially if you stack up the military-industrial complex of the West, quote unquote, the United States, its NATO allies, and some other partner countries, against the military-industrial complex of Russia, I know who's going to win in the long term, especially given the force of the sanctions against the Russian economy. But it is highly concerning that every day, Ukrainians say 200 people are being lost on their side, and similar numbers on the Russian side. So that is a very concerning, it's a tragic situation. So I'm not sure I'm quite where Charlie is, but I do think that we need to start thinking through how we get back to the negotiating table.
So perhaps, to conclude here, we should bring it back again to the domestic picture and thinking about what this trip could mean for Biden. We do have a question about, the ways in which American domestic politics over time could affect U.S. policy toward Ukraine in particular. And a couple of people were wondering whether or not the midterm elections in the United States might have any effect. I've heard, theories both ways. I've heard people make the point that if Biden were to lose his majorities in Congress, that he might actually focus more on foreign policy. But I've also heard people make the case the other way around. I wonder what the two of you think the impact of the midterms could be on U.S. policy towards Ukraine.
Rose, you want to start?
Yeah, it's been remarkable, the bipartisan support so far for our support for Ukraine, and really the enormous amounts. Frankly, I was Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and oddly, that also means I oversaw the Political Military Affairs Bureau, which is where the weapons assistance licensing goes on, that type of thing. And there was always huge, and particularly remembering 2014 and what was going on in the Obama administration. Inside the administration, there was a debate that went on, but in the end of the day, we weren't willing to supply major weapon systems to Ukraine. And now, my gosh, it's 180 degrees different, and with the support of Republicans in Congress. So I guess I would hope that that could continue, even if the midterm elections drove us in the other direction, with Republicans controlling the House and or the Senate. But I do have worries, and Charlie commented on this already. You probably want to pick up this thread, Charlie, about the Make America Great Again crowd coming back and essentially turning inward. And I think Putin's watching that with a very sharp eye, because it's part, I think, of his long-term strategy here, which is to divide and conquer. That's always the Kremlin strategy with regard to NATO. So that's nothing new. But I think that he's thinking very long-term, and thinking that the election can bring a boost to his fortunes in even November of this year.
Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I don't worry that Congress could or would force the Biden administration to make a dramatic change in its policy toward Ukraine. Congress doesn't have the ability to do that. And so far the Republicans, even though there has been some opposition, have teamed up with Democrats to push back. But I remain deeply concerned about the state of American politics, and think that the economic conditions in the country have a lot to do with it. And I was a big supporter of Biden's first steps in office, including Build Back Better. I think that investing in working Americans, investing in infrastructure and healthcare and green technology, getting broadband into rural areas of the country, these are all very, very important steps. And I think that we just need to make sure that we continue on that agenda, that the Biden administration, as it stands up to Russia, refocuses on the critical domestic front. If Biden loses the House and possibly the Senate, that domestic agenda becomes more and more difficult. And as a consequence, we then head into the presidential elections with governmental gridlock. So for me, the worry about the midterms is not so much that we see a fundamental shift in policy toward Ukraine, but that we head into what could be a pretty confrontational and dysfunctional period in American politics.
Yeah. Could I just disagree slightly, Charlie? And that is because Congress holds the purse strings. And the Biden administration had to do some convincing to get the $40 billion out of the Congress, which it's clear is going to. They've said it's going to run out by the end of the year. They will have spent out those funds in terms of supporting Ukraine. And so I can see, if the House and or Senate flip, that getting additional funds out of Congress to support Ukraine could be extremely, extremely difficult. So, and that's, I think, what Putin is watching very closely. He keeps that calendar, I would say, very, very well.
I would say that's a point well taken, and simply throw out one factoid. The winner of the Ohio Senate primary race on the Republican side was J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance was endorsed by Donald Trump. J.D. Vance's position on Ukraine is I could care less.
And isn't that bizarre, seeing he's a veteran?
It's interesting to me because certainly there are also many Republicans who seem to be criticizing the administration for not doing more on Ukraine. So while on the one hand, they would, from a political perspective, have an incentive to try to create gridlock and stop Biden's policy, it might be difficult, at least for those more hawkish Republicans, not to go along with some kind of a re-up of the aid package were it to come up again early next year. But we'll have to wait and find out how all of this goes. I want to give both of you the opportunity to make any final thoughts. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. But let me start with you, Charlie. Anything that we've missed or any points that you want to make before we close?
I think we covered the bases. Just that it's a very important week. I do think the Biden administration deserves kudos for how it's handled the war in Ukraine so far. As I said, having just come back from Europe, I do sense that there is a fluidity, that there is a need for a conversation about marrying the supply of weapons to some kind of diplomatic initiative. And so I do hope that if not next week, we come back to that, because I think it will be important to maintaining transatlantic solidarity, especially if this war is going on when the cold weather begins to set in on the other side of the Atlantic.
Rose?
Yeah, I'd like to just drill down as I wrap up on the issue I brought up regarding weapons of mass destruction deterrence in the strategic concept. And I do think here it'll be worth watching what NATO says about that. I don't expect in some ways a change in declaratory policy, but I do think that there'll be a lot of attention to bolstering resilience against weapons of mass destruction attack, kind of bolstering what I would call the normal retaliatory deterrence policy with a kind of deterrence by denial approach. So that'll be worth watching. The other point is, how much emphasis will the alliance continue to place on dialogue? Circling back to the point that Charlie and I have been discussing throughout, there's always been this two-track approach, right? Deterrence and defense balanced against détente and dialogue. As we've all been saying, now is not the moment to open up new negotiations with Russia on nuclear arms reduction, for example. But how much is NATO going to be willing to continue to articulate that two-track approach, that when the time is right, it too is willing to engage in dialogue with Russia?
That's great. Thanks again to both of you. And thanks to everyone who's joined us here today for this very interesting discussion. There's obviously a lot that we'll be looking forward to seeing what happens about in the next week. For those of you who are interested, the American Statecraft Program is planning another event like this to look at Biden's upcoming travel to the Middle East. That'll be taking place in about 10 days. So if you're interested in that, please take a look. Please be on the lookout for an invitation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.